much, Yannis, for the introduction. Very precise and also information dense. I have to admit I'm slightly awed by the task of talking to you as a Center for Transformation Studies about the transformation of anything, and because as Yannis has outlined, I'm trained more in studying the political economy of resources, and this is also, or at least it was, my entry point into the history of the ocean. So I'm not by any means a historian of the maritime. I, like many engineers and geologists who are currently working to develop a new kind of industry, deep sea mining, initially thought of the ocean mostly as a piece of land with some water on top of it. And so this talk I'm going to give today is partly also reflecting my own journey of realization that the ocean is very far from just being like a piece of land that might or might not hold any resources. So I will, for the purposes of this talk, first say something about how we can think of the changing nature of the ocean in the human imagination of the last 1,000 years or so. Feel free to criticize, ask critical questions, because this is a very broad brush, vivid colors kind of history before we get into the specificities of deep sea mining as such. Yannis has circulated some papers that I have written, and I will assume that that some of you have read them, unlike Yannis. And they are also meant to give us some background as to some of the case studies I have been working on within this sort of broader problem of how and why do we think mining in the deep sea is a particularly good idea. And the image here that we have on the screen is, I think, fairly evocative of this whole notion that we are standing now at the cusp of creating a wholly new kind of industry. Terrestrial mining moved down to 5,000 meters below the surface, and it's an idea which I will show is surprisingly old. It's been around for a long time, and that history really does matter also for the contemporary discussions, which is a point I'll return to. But also, the reason why it is a rainbow, it's because it's an idea that continuously has been seen to be just below the horizon. Just in a few years' time, we'll be able to go there, and we'll be able to mine, and we'll be able to extract these fantastic riches from the ocean. And that notion that this is an industry about to start is also something which has a very long history. And so with these words, I will begin. So also, since this is a Center for Transformation Studies, I'll try to organize the talk around a set of transformations. First, how the ocean itself has been transformed, how then our understanding of the seabed has been transformed, how the resources in the ocean also become something that we can extract and use. And then finally also, which is one of the case studies, how islands as access nodes into the deep sea are also transformed along with the resources that they provide access to. And so for a bit of context and also plugging a forthcoming volume I'm co-editing called Oceans Become, is creating or trying to create a model for understanding these kind of transformations. And we have a model that we call the 3R model, which essentially means you have to study the representations of the ocean and the resources in order to understand how regulations of the ocean have been made. So it's a fairly simple model, but it creates entry points into different case studies across time and space, which will be in that book. So I'm also happy to talk about that in the Q&A afterwards, about how we think about resources as sort of relational constructs, natural features that are made useful depending on our wants, needs, and requirements in the terrestrial economy. So here is the promised broad-brushed history of the ocean. Because the ocean, if you go back, if you go back 1,000 years, particularly if you're in Europe or around the Atlantic, the ocean is a magical place or a supernatural place. It's a place you cannot master. It's a place where fishermen go to die if they venture out into the open sea. And so it's also, for many, it's the end of the known world, and there's no chance that humanity can make an impact on the ocean or the resources in the ocean. It exists, it's populated with mythical creatures that can easily swallow a ship and end the lives of everybody involved. So this is sort of the primordial sea, which is beyond nature and beyond the control of humankind. And as Philip Steinberg has written extensively about, for instance, in his book, The Social Construction of the Ocean, the ocean then goes through a series of transformations as technology improves, our ability to move across the surface improves, and at some point you start mapping the currents, understanding the weather systems, and you can set out to sea and have a fair expectation that at some point you'll be able to return to whence you came from, and also bring with you some kind of wealth. And that transforms also the ocean into an asset or a medium for transportation that can help you generate riches. Importantly, though, it is beyond human control still. There is a debate whether you can measure distances accurately in the ocean, and also whether fisheries can impact the fish stocks in the ocean, and that's a long scientific debate that ranges across centuries and still influences policymaking and fishing quota setting in the EU system, for instance, today. And this very notion that the ocean is a commons, it belongs to everyone, because nobody is able to exercise effective control over the ocean. And this is the basis of Hugo Grotius' famous tract, Mare Liberum, The Freedom of the High Seas, where he also posits that the fish in the sea are an inexhaustible resource. You can take as much as you want out of the ocean, but it will not diminish the utility of the ocean for anybody else, because it's still beyond the range of human influence. Then, as again, technology improves, mapping, and I'll get back to this, we start also to see the ocean in 3 dimensions. It's not just the surface and the water column, but also we discover the nature of the seabed and start thinking about what could be there on the seabed and how can we use that as a part of the expanding global economy. And then we have the final and also incomplete transformation that's underlying the present research on the ocean, the recognition that the ocean is not something which is out there, it's connected to the entire global ecology, and we are all dependent on the oxygen produced there, the fish and other resources, and the health of the ocean is crucial for humanity's future. So as you can see, the ocean and the way we understand it has gone through very drastic changes over the course of a mere 1,000 years. But one argument I want to make is that, and this is probably familiar to you as well, these kind of transformations are incomplete. They don't necessarily remove the previous assumptions, but they also form the basis of the new idea of what the ocean is and what it can be used for. And just to provide some evidence for my assertion that the ocean is a supernatural place, and also shamelessly indulge in a bit of Nordic or Scandi exoticism, I brought some testimonies from some of the first written sources we do have about the nature of the North Atlantic Sea. One is the first Norwegian on record, a man called Ottar, who claims here during a visit to King Alfred's court that he is living in the northernmost place of all Norwegians, and there are no proper people living to the north of him, apart from some Finns, and perhaps, but they don't really count because they are not in a court to record their testimony. And his worldview is also then recorded in this map here from a later Norwegian historian, the first Norwegian historian writing a few centuries later about how Skylla and Charybdis, that Jannis might protest that they are in the Mediterranean, are properly found in the North Atlantic to the north of Norway, which is this very different, deadly space where you will get eaten up if you venture. And also, we have a testimony from a German cleric working with the Archbishop of Bremen, writing that so beyond the land of Northmen, which is the last inhabited province, there are no people living, but the ocean is terrible and infinite. And this is also a really important property of the ocean, that it's also for the Greeks, the Okeanos, you have the ocean encircling the world, and it is in its nature indefinite, so endless in a way. And this is an idea that also has a long history, going all the way, I guess, Hegel also talked about the endless nature of the ocean, so this is an idea that sticks around. But then, the map you see here is the Carta Marina, which is made by a Swedish archbishop, 1539, and it is rightly famous for all of its illustrations of fantastical creatures and sea monsters, etc. And what is quite interesting is that just a few decades later, you have a very different representation of the ocean with the birth of modern cartography and dissemination of knowledge in Europe. So this is a map being made just 6 decades later, and it shows a very different worldview of the Arctic Ocean. Here you have, there is far more attention to whales as useful resources, and you also have the outline, the new land, which is the famous piece of news in this map, which is Willem Barents' discovery of Svalbard. So this is already a different space that is coming into being, and also in the visual representations on maps. So then I'll say a few words about, this is about transformation of the ocean. But if you all close your eyes now and think of nothing, and now you can open them again. Now you have had the same image of the seabed that humanity has had until just, say, 150 years ago, perhaps. It has been unknowable and unreachable without the aid of the imagination and the mind itself. So the transformation of the seabed and the coming into being of the seabed is also a global phenomenon of importance, and it's not something that occurred as a very natural process. This has happened because there are specific ideas about what it can be used for, and also what is the nature of the seabed. So for a long time it was assumed that the seabed was pretty much also beyond human reach, and that whatever was lying below was flat as a ballroom floor, and it was covered with sediments created by shells of dead animals and algae, krill, etc. And so it would be fairly even and hundreds, if not 1,000 meters thick layer of sediments. And that seemed to be a very useful property of the seabed once modern communication technologies spawned the need for the modern telegraph and the transatlantic telegraph. And if you read the account by the first self-proclaimed historian of the laying of the transatlantic cable, politician and overt racist John Mullaly, in his book The Laying of the Cable, by the official historian of the venture, and he was also taking part of it, he describes the ocean as a prairie, and even this speaks to also a supernatural idea about the ocean, that this was being made for humanity's use, and it was flat because humanity would need a flat surface for laying telegraph cables. And at the same time, in the mid-19th century, there were a series of investigations being made by hydrographers who were interested in the nature of currents to better move navies about. Matthew Fontaine-Maury, seen here, was the preeminent scholar of his day, working for the US Navy to map the currents. He also recorded and described the findings about the nature of seabed in the physical geography of the ocean, and as he made very clear, there are no minerals to be found, so also this idea that the flat ocean floor cannot really be thought of as a mining site is also evident. No grains of particles larger than a mustard seed, so obviously nobody's thinking about mining on the seabed at this point by 1857-58. And you can also see here on this map, there's a feature that appeared on maps until the early 20th century, a part of the ocean that was called the Telegraph Plateau, because it was even seen to be such useful and flat for telegraph cables. So, while Maury and others and their investigations is testimony to a burgeoning ability to reach the seabed and an interest in the seabed, the real breakthrough only occurs a few decades later with the HMS Challenger expedition, which is regarded as the birth of modern oceanography, or perhaps the culmination of the imperial conquest of the globe by circumnavigation that also set out using fairly simple sampling equipment, essentially cannonballs attached to small tubes, lowered into sediment in the seabed, and that they could then pull up to the surface to both map the depth, because there was no knowledge about how deep are these oceans really, and also what is the nature of the seabed. And they did discover something new during some dredge hauls in the Atlantic Ocean in February and March 1873. They pulled up something looking like this, manganese oxide nodules that were previously unknown to science. And like all really, really important discoveries, they were first reported in a letter to Dad by the expedition chemist John Young Buchan, who I read his diary, and what he writes also speaks to the understanding of the seabed, because he looks at these nodules and concludes that they are oxides consisting of manganese, cobalt, nickel, copper predominantly, and then also some other trace minerals. And he realizes that at the time, of course, manganese is a mineral that is in very, very high demand because of the second industrial revolution. It has been discovered that to make high quality steel, if you add manganese or an alloy of manganese, Spiegeleisen, you can deoxidize and desulfurize steel and make it much higher quality. But interestingly, his mind turns to its potential use in the chemical industries as a bleaching powder. What he also knows is, of course, there's no prospect of ever extracting this, at least for the time being, within a reasonable time horizon, but one day perhaps. And it turns out, and I'll return to this also, it takes quite a long time before this is seen as an important fact in geology. So what is interesting is that after the Challenger, it becomes fashionable for states to send out ships and to engage in this kind of really expensive expedition-style cruises that are interdisciplinary undertakings involving not only sailors from the Navy, but also chemists and other scientific disciplines. So this is the Vøringen, which is the Norwegian equivalent, setting sail the summer 1876. And one of its main objectives was to sail in the North Atlantic and essentially rename it the Norwegian Sea. So naming is claiming. It's also a way to make representations valid and politically important. And they also wanted to figure out, okay, what is the nature of the seabed in this area? And what they found is represented in this map, and the small black dots are the sampling stations. It was all mud. It was gray mud, it was brown mud, it was red mud, but mud all the way down. In only one station to the south did they find something that seemed to be some kind of porous agglomeration of some kind of minerals, but they did write in the scientific report that the formation of nodules reported by the Challenger, occurring in pretty much all the oceans it visited in great quantities, did not take place in the Norwegian Sea. So that was perhaps a disappointment, but nobody still gave any thought to potential mining. And this persisted until another, up to and including another Scandinavian research cruise, the famed oceanographer Hans Pettersson's oceanographic expedition, one of the first major post-war expeditions. He circumnavigated the globe following in the wake of the Challenger, published his accounts in many European languages, not just Swedish, and he also encountered the nodules and noted that it's really, really difficult to get down to them. And he also speculated on the lack of human understanding of the seabed and noted that from the Atlantic, we only have one sample that's from more than 4,000 meters below the surface. So literally, this is still inaccessible territory. And then something changes, and it changes quickly and rather rapidly. And one of the drivers here is the Second World War, which gives the global navies a new interest in the three-dimensional nature of warfare at sea. So particularly submarine warfare encourages and greatly stimulates research into the nature of ocean currents, different salinity levels, different temperature ranges that can be used to hide submarines in different layers of water. And the conductivity of the water becomes something which is a matter of life and death, essentially. So there is a great interest in new devices that can help you gauge the depth and also the speed of currents, etc., etc. And just to show how quickly this changes, in 1950, during a scientific expedition, they do pull up nodules successfully, but they have no way of looking at them and seeing them in situ on the seabed. But 7 years later, during the International Geophysical Year, underwater camera technology makes the seabed visible. And then you can take pictures and you can see these vast fields of nodules just lying there on flat surfaces. So that also is fundamental to reigniting this idea or giving birth to this idea that, well, you can actually access these minerals lying there on the seabed. And the International Geophysical Year is an important event also in the Cold War, but it also ensures that these findings are globally disseminated, and they also pull up a large haul of nodules off the coast of Tahiti in 1957, really demonstrating that there are in fact a lot of minerals down there on the seabed. And that idea and the dissemination is a global phenomenon. So, for instance, this is a Norwegian newspaper reporting on how the great depths of the ocean will be vacuumed for valuable minerals. And the idea is you have the image of the ballroom floor with the minerals lying on top as small lumps like potatoes of minerals, and then you can just design a big underwater vacuum cleaner and you can suck it up. So it's very convenient. It doesn't have any of the problems of traditional mines on land with explosions of mining gases or people. You can just build a sufficiently large vacuum cleaner and then the problem is solved. And enormous values waiting to be brought to the surface, as it says. And in the lower left corner, right corner, is an image that comes from the National Archives of Tokyo. It's a Soviet book on underwater mining, which is then translated into Japanese. So it just shows that this is a global occurrence. So just a few headlines. I have a Dutch PhD who also helped track down some newspaper articles in that inscrutable language. So treasures from below the surface of the sea. Then you have the Norwegian, the inexhaustible riches on the seabed, and also, and this is an interesting representation that we can also talk about in Q&A, is how the inner space mirrors the race for the outer space. So this is spacefaring, something monopolized by the great superpowers, whereas even for smaller powers or countries in Europe, going down to the seabed is akin to space travel and is something which is feasible and within their financial means. And that also, there's some interesting parallels in the regulatory regimes that develop for space travel and for the ocean, which is another talk if you'll have me back. And also, in addition to the images of localized sites on the seabed, for the first time you also started getting a global view, a properly global view of the seabed. And that has a lot of it has to do with the work done by Marie Tharp and her collaborator Bruce Heason, who first started transforming depth recordings into visual representations of the depth of the seafloor. And it's useful to recall also that the idea of plate tectonics, which today we take for granted and is in all of the Discovery Channel documentaries that our kids watch about volcanoes, that was highly disputed. So Alfred Wegener had proposed it, and he might have lived to see himself vindicated if he hadn't sort of stupidly gotten himself killed on an expedition to Greenland. But he had proposed the idea of plate tectonics, but it was not generally accepted until you got these maps. And suddenly this feature, the mid-Atlantic ridge, becomes visible and helps explain how the continents shift and move and how the United States, thankfully, is growing further apart from Europe every passing year. And this visual representation is also interestingly made by an Austrian painter, Heinrich Beran, who had made his career painting alpine resorts. So you see he has a flair for sort of the dramatic vertical dimension of the landscape. And he made a series of maps that were circulated in National Geographic in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I even have politicians on record saying, wow, look at these maps. It looks just like land with valleys, with mountains, and suddenly you are transforming this bouldering floor into something that is a familiar type of terrain. Deep mountain valleys where you can also presumably mine for minerals, if only we can get down there to them. And that also prefigures the more contemporary maps of different kinds of mineral resources. The sharp-eyed observers will notice how these different kinds of underwater mineral mining sites that have been identified also mirror the tectonic plates. So particularly the Ring of Fire in the Pacific seems to be a very promising site to find one of the types of deposits, the massive sulfides, which occur alongside these territories. And then you have the nodules, which are formed in a different way, which some of you have read about in the paper, which are widely distributed in different terrains. And also, just to note, this year the map is just a few years old, but it's also already widely outdated because we now have far more potential sites, particularly also if you look between Greenland and Svalbard there. Recent research has located a lot of new potential mining areas. So the maps of the seabed change our understanding of the seabed, also transforms quite radically. And just also to give you a small sense of these different resources. Essentially, the nodules, they are the first type of mineral resource that they located. And the second type is the sulfides forming around deep sea vent systems. This was a discovery that was only really made and confirmed in 1977. Later, it was also, by the early 1980s, realized that in addition to these sulfide crust deposits that form where hot water is rising from beneath the seabed, and where the change in pressure and temperature makes minerals that have been bound up with water being deposited in concentrations that are high enough to form potentially vast mineral deposits. That discovery later was followed by the realization that the ocean itself deposits on seamounts, underwater mountains, that they then realized existed, can cover them over long periods of time with thin layers of minerals that you could potentially scrape off because they're highly rich in cobalt. And a few other minerals, but particularly it was cobalt that tickled everybody's fancies in the 1980s because there were some, and this is where the political economy dimension of the story comes in, because there was a discussion about an embargo on cobalt and other critical minerals, and so the cobalt price went through the ceiling, and then also the search to find a new kind of resource that could be utilized. And just another example of how political economy drives the discovery of new types of mineral resources. You will recall that the first paper talks about three major types of mineral deposits in the sea: the nodules, the potatoes, the vents, and the crusts. Recently, Japanese researchers have also claimed there's a new kind of mineral resource, which is essentially dead fish gathered close to a few islands where there in previous times have been upwellings of nutrients, and over millennia or millions of years they have been enriched by absorbing minute quantities of rare earth elements from the seawater, and then making this essentially a mud that you can mine from the seabed as well. And this incidentally became a very popular idea after 2011, when there was the embargo, or what the Chinese claimed were unfortunate delays in port clearance of exports of rare earth elements. And the Japanese said, well, we don't care because we can just dig up these muds which are just located on the seabed. And the ocean then not only holds different kinds of mineral products that are produced in different ways, there has even been the idea to mine the ocean itself for minerals. And you will recall this idea that the ocean belongs to everyone. The salt water, like air, going all the way back to the Romans, is something that is free and usable for everyone. And like fish, it holds mineral quantities that can be used by anyone. And if you think about it, we have been extracting salt from seawater for a very long time. So it's not as far-fetched as it seems. And then also in 1850, if I recall correctly, it was also discovered that seawater held all other kinds of useful minerals as well. And that set in motion essentially a whole range of different schemes to extract these valuable minerals from the seabed. One of my favorites is this, which was a scheme in the US to extract gold from seawater at a profit, run by a reverend who then later absconded with all of the money from the investors, leaving behind something resembling a factory with some useless contraptions that were gold accumulators. So at least he made some money from the venture. But it wasn't just the fraudsters that seized upon this idea. This very Bond villain-looking type, Fritz Haber, renowned German scientist, also went on a research cruise in the interwar period with a ship called the Meteor to try to figure out what part of the ocean held the richest concentrations of gold in the seawater. Because if he could extract that gold, he could repay the debts that Germany had incurred due to some unfortunate events just a few years earlier. So the idea was to take gold from seawater to repay the debts. So there is then this expectation that the ocean holds enormous riches. And also magnesium was a critical mineral extracted from the seawater, crucial to the production of airplanes, etc., during the Second World War. So this idea of taking minerals from the sea and not paying anyone for the benefit is something which has existed in practice. And then this also speaks to how the nodules form, because there was and still is some uncertainties of how they are actually formed, and there are several processes at work. There are both biogenic and hydrogenic, and there's this idea that they are dissipated out of the water and then accumulated through various processes. And so this is also a way of thinking of them as sort of the product of the free seawater just collected in a very handy grab-sized bite package that you could vacuum up. And also, since the ocean is huge and the mineral content of seawater even though minute in a liter, if you take the whole Pacific, you will have lots and lots and lots and lots of minerals that are then deposited on the seabed. And potentially, depending on the rate, it might even grow faster than it's possible to extract them. And to go back to the letter to father and Buchanan's expectation that someday people might care about the discovery, it took a surprisingly long time, because these are the numbers of scientific papers published on nodules. So just above 0 for a very, very, very long time. And even by sort of the mid-1940s, you have Austrian chemists discussing it and saying this is essentially scientific curiosities, no practical purpose. But then in 1952, during the height of the Korean War, when minerals prices are again shooting through the ceiling, something happens. And there is this guy, Harry S. Truman, probably the American president that has been born the furthest away from the ocean, who then sets in motion a revolution in oceanic affairs, similar to what Hugo Grotius had done in 1609. Because he, in 1945, makes a proclamation that the US has the sovereign rights over the seabed that is appurtenant to the United States in the Mexican Gulf, or sorry, Gulf of America, as it's now called. And nobody knew what appurtenant meant. And that was by design, because they wanted to say that, well, we own parts of the seabed, but we cannot really, we're not sure if we can claim that it's a part of our sovereign territory. So we'll settle for this term and hope nobody will notice. The important thing is that the federal government will assert its claim to the seabed, the shallow waters where the oil companies can move in, and not the states. So his purpose was to stop Louisiana from taxing and claiming the oil resources in the Gulf of Mexico. But this idea that a state could claim the seabed beyond the territorial waters was revolutionary. And it was followed by a race globally to assert a large, what we today know as exclusive economic zones. Several Latin American states dependent on fisheries, such as Peru and Chile and others, said they defined a concept called the patrimonial sea and say, we've been fishing here, so we own this piece of ocean. So this is a complete break with the idea of the freedom of the high seas that previously had governed oceanic matters. And that happens simultaneously, more or less, with this idea that you can start pulling up the nodules in paying quantities. There's a student paper in 1952 speculating about the immense quantities of manganese, and there's a government report from 1952 as well, where this idea is first broached. And they say maybe in 25 years, by 1977, we will have the technology to mine these resources from the seabed. And it doesn't take 25 years for interest in this to really, really grow. Because stimulated by the economic growth in the 1950s, 1960s, there are concerns that the globe is running out of resources. So particularly in Germany, there is a scare of the lack of nickel for heavy industry. And there is, of course, the Cold War race, and there's fear of a militarization of the seabed. You have submarine warfare and also the prospect of nuclear installations on the seabed. And that prompts this man, Arvid Pardo, a Swedish-Maltese diplomat, who is Malta's representative to the UN General Assembly, to go before the General Assembly in November 1967 and propose a whole novel concept or ownership of the deep sea. And he gives a very long even for my standards, a very long speech lasting for hours, giving statistics about the seabed, warning against essentially the threat the destruction of the ocean will pose to humanity. And he proposes that the whole of this area is declared the common heritage of mankind. And that concept is then taken up through a series of discussions that turn into the Law of the Sea Convention, which is today sort of the constitution for the oceans. But in his work, or in this fundamental speech, which is the foundational moment of the current ocean governance architecture, is this quote, which is based on the work of the student who wrote this paper in 1952, John Merrow, who was from the not particularly maritime location of South Dakota, who then also was seized of this idea that there's so much water, there's so much minerals, that they will form faster than we can extract them. And just to give you a sense of how radical this idea is, when we talk of resources, we tend to talk about renewable and non-renewable. And mining has always been sort of the prime example of a non-renewable industry. So you take the minerals out of the ground and it's gone, non-renewable. But here, in the ocean, because of the properties of the ocean, minerals are growing. And they're growing, in some cases, like Christmas trees with the discovery of the vents, which hadn't been discovered at this time. It was only the nodules, but they are forming and they are usable. And so essentially, we don't have to worry about all of those problems that arise from uneven distribution of resources on land. We don't have to worry about resource ownership, meaning that the new international economic order movement in the global south, nationalization, expropriation of mining corporation assets, not a problem, because we'll just venture out to the deep sea area and pull the resources up from there. And that also led him to produce these kind of figures, saying that, well, in land, we'll run out of aluminium, well, meaning bauxite, in 100 years. But if we start pulling this up from the ocean, we have all we could possibly need for 20,000 years. Manganese, this crucial industrial ingredient, 400,000 years. Even copper and later also such a crucial source as cobalt, it can sustain human civilization pretty much indefinitely. And this is an incredibly powerful message that resonates among policymakers in many different countries. Not everyone is positive, though, because some countries, let's say you are a newly independent nation of Zambia and you depend on copper exports, it's not great to have this prospect of an endless and also cheap resource in the deep sea. Or if you are a slightly less underdeveloped country, such as Canada, also reliant on exports of nickel, then also it's not a great idea. So this idea of oceanic abundance is so strong that a lot of the Law of the Sea Convention negotiations are actually over how can we control the rate of production from the sea. Because they also still were talking about this is going to happen in just a few years, and then it can destroy the economic basis for a lot of the decolonizing world who are depending on these revenues to create functioning societies for their inhabitants. So this is also why this idea of oceanic abundance has real-life political repercussions. And it also feeds into a concern at the time that the world is also on an unsustainable trajectory with, for instance, the Club of Rome report and others producing figures showing that hockey stick graphs saying that, well, we are in the great acceleration, we're consuming way more than we can possibly produce. And then, lo and behold, this could be the solution. So just to also, because I see in the interest of time, this is sort of a timeline of how these different mineral deposits or minerals producing properties of the ocean fit into a historical timeline. So you have the discovery in 1965 of the brine pools in the Red Sea, that incredibly salt-heavy water containing many mineral resources lying between the not particularly maritime nation of Saudi Arabia and Sudan. They managed to come up with a scheme to actually divide the Red Sea between them when it comes to minerals extraction, and a German corporation goes there, and for a long time it was the most researched part of potential deep-sea mining sites in the world. Then we have the discovery in 1977 and of the deep-sea vents, and also, surprisingly, to the oceanographers and the scientists doing this, they discovered life on the deep-sea vents south of the Galapagos Islands. And this was a revolutionary discovery, because you had the first proof of an ecosystem not depending on photosynthesis, but rather chemosynthesis. They were based on bacteria drawing energy from the hot water and the chemicals, and that was the basis for a food chain that did not in any way relate to the sun. And that is also a revolutionary discovery, because it changes our entire idea of how life on this planet has come into being and how it can subsist. And that is almost within my lifetime and changes the way we thought about life for thousands and thousands of years. And so the question is, do you want to break? Do you want to continue this afterwards, or should I try to wrap this up quickly?
Tell us about the islands, right?
Yeah, okay. And this, I won't speak for as long about the islands, because they are, well, it's in the written case study. But this is also just to show you how space functions in a different way in the ocean. Because you have, in the middle of the Pacific, really minute islands. This is a picture of Minami Torishima. There is another island, which is, or group of islands, which is even smaller. At high tide, it's probably these three desks that are the only thing protruding above sea level. So it sort of challenges the definition of what is an actual island. The importance of these islands is that they provide access to resources, and they have served as these critical nodes within the global economy for more than 150 years. And in the paper, I use Minami Torishima, this triangle in the middle, which is the westernmost point of the county of Tokyo, on the map here, to show just how this very, very small speck of land has produced conflict between Japan and the United States for such a long period over such different resources. First, it was for guano, which was seen as almost magical fertilizer, incredibly important during the 19th century, when the productive capacity of agriculture seemed to be reaching some natural limits. If you could use guano, then you could improve your harvests sufficiently to enlarge your population. So it was seen as such a critical resource that US Congress signed a law in 1856 saying that the US president can essentially empower US citizens to claim islands in the middle of the Pacific or in the Atlantic or anywhere which are uninhabited, and the US will protect them while they are extracting the guano. Because guano is, well, bird feces, and the original title of the paper was Shitty Places, but the editors didn't like it for some reason, which are then fossilized and really rich in nutrients. These claims under the Guano Act still today produce conflict between governments. So there is one island of Navassa in the Caribbean, which is still disputed, owing to the claim made by US that nobody owns this and we can extract this resource, and then therefore we have a kind of sovereignty. But the sovereignty is dependent on the presence of the resource. So what happens when the resource is extracted or depleted and there's nothing left? Nobody knew. And so there were several hundred islands, and the State Department itself admitted we've lost count of how many islands we have claimed under this law and who owns these islands today. And I just zoom in on Minami Torishima to look at how that goes through a series of shifting ownerships and occupation as the Japanese trappers go there to get bird feathers for global fashion markets, and their interests clash with the guano miners. Then, of course, comes the Second World War, and it's being used as a base. And then, more recently, it is the staging ground for the Japanese adventure looking for these biogenic muds with rare earth elements. And what then happens is that for some of these islands, China then contests the Japanese claim to ownership, saying, well, these aren't proper islands, these are just rocks. And the distinction is really, really crucial, because under the Law of the Sea Convention, if you have an island, you have an exclusive economic zone, 200 nautical miles, and you have sovereign rights to the resources of the seabed. If it's just a rock, well, it's a security zone, and you can essentially tell people not to crash into it. That is the range of your control and ownership. So these islands, even though they are very small, are also incredibly important places in the political economy of the ocean. And also, an interesting thing is that when you look at the succession of these resources, they produce, it's quite astounding that what is essentially a bunch of coral rocks is so contested as a production site for so many resources over such a long period of time. And then just to explain where the current debate about deep sea mining comes from, it is, of course, the green transition, which we have all been talking about and been thinking about for the last 5 years or so, and what that means for the demand for minerals. And this is being seized upon to an astounding effect by mining companies and others to say that we need to figure out a new source of minerals to make the green transition happen. And that enables a lot of different claims to ownership on the seabed also to be made. And all kinds of actors try to weigh in on determining what is the future of deep sea mining going to be, based on an estimate that the current technology path will depend an increase in the global production of major minerals like copper and nickel at least 6 times the present rate. So, of course, again, deep sea mining seems to be a solution to a global and even existential problem. And just to also show how this is being presented, you're all aware with these great acceleration hockey sticks. There is also similar projections made for the ocean. And if you look at them, you see deep sea minerals up here in sea seem to be an industry which is rapidly on the rise. But this is not, this is widely misleading, because this is not commercial deep sea mining. This is the amount of territory which has been licensed through the International Seabed Authority by corporations sponsored by states. There is, as of yet, not anywhere any commercially viable deep sea mining industry in operation, even though its imminent start has been suggested for more than 25 years, as you are now very well aware. So these are claims to explore and not to exploit. And there's a very significant difference. So to wrap up, we think, if you look at policy documents or mission statements from the UN, standing for a new transformation of the ocean, a future ocean, which the UN Decade of Ocean Science proclaims to be the ocean we want. And this is a very anthropocentric understanding of the ocean, and that the ocean will be clean, healthy, productive, safe, accessible, inspiring, and engaging. And we can all hope, but as you now know and realize, this idea of the productive ocean is an idea which has some very problematic connotations and also some very deep historical roots. Essentially what the UN or President Trump or the Cook Islands, or indeed my own Norwegian government, which is currently debating whether and under what conditions to commence deep sea mining in the middle of ecosystems where we have very little understanding of how they actually function, how the food webs, how they operate, how the chemistry will be affected by this activity, shows that there is still this idea or the hope that as economic growth rates flattens out and the minerals demands for the green transition are so high that we need some kind of solution to enable us not to make any hard choices in our own everyday lives that will require some hard political choices. Again, we just look to the sea and hope that it will somehow magically solve our problems. And that is a historical explanation, a deep historical explanation for the current craze for deep sea mining, which is still just below the horizon, like the gold pot at the end of the rainbow. So, thank you.